A unicorn so named, at the time they were named, they were rare, and hence the term unicorn. A unicorn is $1 billion tech startup. A Solara is $1 trillion tech startup. I coined the term. The Solara is the new unicorn, the rare company that crosses $1 trillion in value, but I think many more will cross that line over the next 5 years, definitely 10 years. We'll have seen as many Solaras in 10 years as we see unicorns today all over the world in different tech hubs. Product market fit is the holy grail. Everybody talks about it, and for good reason. But product market fit is the beginning of the journey. Too many tech startups think that is it. You achieve product market fit and you have arrived and you can relax a little bit. Not true. And a huge blind spot that I see is tech startups take pride in neglecting marketing. Marketing is supposed to be an afterthought. If you have great product market fit, you should not need marketing. A lot of people define product market fit that way. That's the point where like your product is so good, it sells by itself. That is such a huge misconception. Respect marketing. Why? Because it is essential to achieving unicorn status. Product is not enough. In fact, because of generative AI, it has become so much easier to build something. The bottleneck now is marketing. The point I'm trying to make is any tech startup that has achieved product market fit has the option to achieve unicorn status. How? First step, respect marketing. Marketing is how you get there. Marketing is not an afterthought. Marketing is not this decoration that you throw on top of your product. Marketing has to be thought of as propulsion. The rocket engine's propulsion, that is marketing. Your product is the rocket, the propulsion is marketing. Marketing is how you determine revenue. Revenue is not accidental. Through your marketing, you decide, what kind of revenues do you see? Do you see fairly good revenue or do you see exponential revenue? And that's a lever. It's like when you're driving a car, you decide how fast the car goes. You press a little bit more, and the car goes faster. Marketing is like that. The revenue shouldn't surprise you after a while. After you have achieved product market fit and you have been, generating revenues and increasing revenues, after a while, after the marketing has its grip, marketing is in momentum, you should be able to predict your revenue. Do you want to go faster or even faster, much faster? That's marketing. And strong revenues mean fundraising becomes so much easier. These investors, these VC, they get bombarded with so many tech ideas, so many pitches all day long. You can't blame them for getting jaded. But what they do understand is this graph of revenue growth. If they see that, they don't really even have to understand the idea. So marketing brings in revenues make fundraising easy, and you grow. So that's the first thing, revenues. The biggest misconception in marketing is people think marketing is broadcasting. You're out there, you're talking about the product on different social media channels, broadcasting. The truth is the most important function of marketing is listening. You are using marketing channels to listen to the market, to your customer base, potential customer base, and the market in the abstract. That is the number one function of marketing. It is listening, not broadcasting. What happens when you really listen to the market? You discover adjacent spaces, which is how you grow. So when I said every tech startup that has managed product market fit can hope to achieve unicorn status, What I'm getting at is this concept of adjacent spaces. Marketing helps you figure out what your adjacent spaces are, and then you expand into those spaces. Used to be, you know, for promising tech startups, adjacent spaces used to be just virgin territory. There's nobody there. But nowadays, more likely than not, there's another tech startup. Maybe they launched around the same time you did. There's another tech startup, promising tech startup, great team, great fundamentals, and they happen to occupy that adjacent space where you are at. Well, you could get into a brutal battle, and one startup wins, or I recommend what I call cooperation capitalism. What is cooperation capitalism? It's like when you do discover those adjacent spaces and you do discover there are promising tech startups that impress you in terms of how good their fundamentals are, how good their teams are, and how good their vision is. Instead of trying to duke it out and battle it out, you merge. You have a respectful merger. Nobody's buying anybody out. You just merge the two companies, the three companies, the four companies, however many you see along the way. And that is how you achieve unicorn status, through those respectful mergers where, no company is buying another company. It's a merger. There's a new corporate structure, there's a new equity structure, but it's a merger. And that is a great way to expand into adjacent spaces. Adjacent spaces that you get to see through smart marketing. Why would a tech startup merge? Why would you merge with another tech startup? You would merge because 2 plus 2 is 5. Done well, 2 plus 2 is 10. That is why. That is why you would merge. It would both or all those tech startups. I would think, a tech startup might do 10 of those mergers on their way to achieving unicorn status. So that synergy releases value. That is why you would merge. Just like too many tech startups think product market fit is it. That is it. You achieve product market fit and you have arrived, and then they relax. Big mistake. Another big mistake is, thinking, okay, once you have achieved unicorn status, you are established, you're likely to have staying power, things are looking good, and you can relax a little bit. And especially now, with all the tools that have become available, post AI, now much bigger things have become possible. I think just like any tech startup can hope to achieve unicorn status by discovering adjacent spaces through marketing, through relentless revenue generation. A unicorn similarly has the option to try and achieve Solara status. That requires a lot of imagination, I think a Solara today would be about reimagining an existing industry, not a product, not a service, but an industry, or inventing an entirely new industry. So mostly imagination work. And from launch to that Solara status, I would think you're looking at about, 100 mergers along the way, 100 respectful mergers. Later on, when you have passed unicorn status, there might be money involved, and that's okay. But there's something beautiful about tech startups. When you merge with a tech startup team, you get so much that you just can't get when you just hire a random, smart, hardworking person. There's some gelling that happens in a tech startup. Tech startups tend to attract a certain kind of people, and that is priceless. That fire in the belly, that's priceless. You can see it on a resume. You can't decipher easily or quickly in an interview, in a conversation. But if they're doing a tech startup, if they have hit certain milestones, that tells you something which is priceless. If you A company that merges with 100 tech startups on the way to Solara status is going to be in a very strong position. But, there's the Columbus way. Columbus was headed to India. He never ended up in India. But the Columbus way not only does not take you to India, it absolutely cannot take you to the moon. Right? So if you're just launching, the best way to achieve Solara status is to think like you're headed to the moon. A 10-year roadmap, a 15-year roadmap, very well thought out steps. Of course, there's plenty of iteration along the way, but there has to be plenty of rethinking, and the industry you're targeting, the new industry you're imagining, like a lot of it can be fleshed out. That I call the grand Solara vision, as in your starting point, even before you build your product, is the grand Solara vision. This $1 trillion in 10 years, 15 years, 12 years vision. That has got to be the starting point. With that clarity of vision, it becomes much easier to build, to market, to look for those adjacent spaces that might have other tech startups that you might want to merge with, and so on. To achieve Solara status on a compressed schedule of 10, 12, 15 years, I think you need that. You have to have that grand Solara vision, well articulated, and as detailed a roadmap as possible, projecting over 10 years. Of course, that will change. And the biggest reason that will change is because I think there are at least 10 internet-sized technology. They are just exploding, and they are intersecting with each other. There are all sorts of permutations and combinations becoming possible, and it's hard to see, 2 years out, 5 years out. So pretty much impossible to see, 10 years out. But you still have to have that map, that idea, that imagination, and then you iterate along the way. But more has become possible. When Apple crossed $200 billion in market value, Steve Jobs couldn't believe it. He's like, can you believe this? Can you believe we are bigger than Microsoft? He never thought that would happen, but it happened. Well, today Apple itself is several $1 trillion. There are a bunch of $1 trillion companies, and this is just a start. The Solara is the new unicorn, that rare company, and I think we'll see so many of those over the next 10 years in different parts of the world. Why? Because the tools are so much more powerful. More has become possible. What was Instagram when it launched, right? A basic photo sharing app. A high school student could build it over one weekend right now, but Instagram has that network. Well, right now, much bigger things have become possible. In fact, for investors, I would think, instead of trying to figure out, trying to acquire domain expertise in one particular technology, there are more than 10 of those exploding. It would be hard for anybody to even master one domain. So what do? I think the saving grace there is look for entrepreneurs who are trying to solve the biggest problems, tackle the biggest challenges, and bet on them. Why? Because the tech is secondary. The technology is secondary. The tech is the tool, but you're supposed to use those tools to solve problems. And now, because tech is so much more powerful compared to even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, a bold entrepreneur with a bold vision can hope to tackle really big problems, really big global problems. That is where we stand. And hence talk of the grand Solara vision as a great starting point. Vision is a premium asset. In fact, what I'm saying is that is the indispensable starting point. The grand Solara vision as the starting point, for a roadmap, for an ambitious roadmap. The vision is an asset. The spec, we still deal with specs. But now the specs payload is much, much heavier. The spec of a photo sharing app is going to be pretty lightweight compared to the spec of a startup that is hoping to reimagine an entire industry. Generative AI has changed the game completely, right? Code generation, it's like factory mode. Large scale code generation. Coders in cutting edge companies like say Anthropic, right? A lot of them, they are like, I generate 100% of my code. That is the usual conversations we overhear. Coding has become, like such a large scale endeavor. Well, that also applies to research. That applies to marketing. Generative AI has impacted all the fundamentals of how a tech startup gets built. So when the limiting factor is no longer engineering, what is the limiting factor? Imagination. Imagination is is now the bottleneck. How big your tech startup will grow depends on your imagination, your domain expertise, and your imagination. Somebody who has domain expertise of an industry that they're trying to invent will have a huge advantage, but that domain expertise has to be coupled with imagination, and not just individuals. Best done in teams. A team trying to reinvent an industry will be well served if they couple their domain expertise with imagination. So if you have a tech startup with product market fit, you should be able to figure out a pathway to unicorn status in something like, 5 years. Are you respecting marketing? Is marketing an afterthought? Is your whole focus on, the product? As in, if I build a great enough product, I don't need marketing. No. That is a disservice to the company. Of course, product is fundamental. Product is the foundation. Of course, product is important. Of course, product market fit is important. You can't even get out of the gate if you don't have that PMF. But respect marketing, understand what marketing is, get outside help as necessary, do it the right way, look for the adjacent spaces, and scout out those other tech startups with which you might merge on your way to unicorn status. That is why I say every tech startup that has managed product market fit should be able to achieve unicorn status. In this day and age, it should be a 5-year run. You should be able to do it in 5 years.